All right. Well, welcome to Conversations on Retail. My name is Matt Pfeiffer. We're very excited to be back with Brand Elverston to continue his series focused on asset protection and risk mitigation. Today, Brand's guest is Graham Plaster, Director of Nautilus. We're looking forward to starting that conversation. But just a few notes before we get started. First of all, this series and others is presented by our friends at West Rock Coffee Company with offices in 10 countries. They source coffee and tea from more than 35 origin countries. And for more information, you can visit them at westrockcoffee.com. This series has also got some great sponsors, including Barcoding, Rapid-Tag, Ocucon, and Everseen. Check them out. We thank them so much. In case you missed it, Brand is built quite a body of work with us in this series, and you can check out each of the interviews that he has, or conversations rather, that he's led on our YouTube channel. Simply go to @ConversationsOnRetail. Lastly, this just a reminder, this is intended to be a conversation and not a presentation. So we would love for you all who are joining us live to actively participate. And you can do that by clicking on the Q&A button and in Zoom and submitting your questions and comments in writing. And then at the end, if time allows, maybe Brand and Graham will decide we'll stop recording. We'll open up the microphones and allow for some open discussion. So if you've got conversation at the end, if time allows, just click on the raise hand button and we'll give you an opportunity to talk. We're so glad you're here. Brand, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's get started.
All right. Good morning, everybody. As Matt said, I'm Brand Elverston for the few that may not know me. And I want to kind of set the stage before we give Graham a chance to go through his background. Most everyone knows that I was almost 22 years at Walmart Corporate in the asset protection risk mitigation space. And probably around the mid-2000s, I was fortunate enough to have a vice president that understood that what we're doing today may not get us to tomorrow, and allowed some flexibility in exploring non-traditional solutions, which Graham and I are going to talk through, to include DARPA. Many of you are familiar with DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, sort of, and Graham, maybe this is a Reader's Digest version, basically the R&D arm of DoD, and a lot of great things come out of there. We went to MIT Media Lab, Lockheed, Boeing, Auburn's RFID lab. Before that, it was the University of Arkansas RFID lab, and a range of other non-traditional providers to essentially explain the risks of retail, not just the nefarious intent, but all liabilities, to include what we now have painfully become numb to, the active shooter, the risks of violence in retail, and all of that space, and understanding that there is quite possibly a different innovation channel and source, and that could be DoD or those that are working in the public space versus private. And that's my guest, Graham Plaster. I met Graham back in the month of March while I was attending a national security / think tank conference in Washington, D.C. And after Graham's discussion and presentation, I just knew he'd be a perfect fit here to help us in the private sector, i.e. retail, get a flavor for if you're really not satisfied with the solution set that's out there today, there are other options. It just takes, number one, awareness, what those options may be, and then Graham is going to help guide us through some channels of contact. So if I'm at Target or if I'm at Home Depot and I'm excited about what I've heard, there'll be some breadcrumbs there to start that process. So my guest, as Matt said, Graham Plaster. Graham, I'll give you a few minutes to give your background, and then we'll get started.
So I apologize in advance if you hear any barking. I've got two bird dogs in my office, and they like to bark at the FedEx drivers. My background is I graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy right after 9/11. So I've been in the Navy or affiliated with the Navy for the last 21 years. So first 11 years worked on a ship, and then was the assistant dean of students at the Naval War College, which is a graduate program up in Rhode Island. And then I went into the diplomatic corps, which meant that I got to learn some Arabic and then work at the Pentagon doing some work under the Army, actually, back and forth to the Middle East and North Africa for a few years. got out in 2013 and started a company. Also moonlit and worked as a policy advisor at the Pentagon for several years, and then became a vice president of an Alaska Native corporation, which is a really interesting capability within government contracting we could go into sometime. And then from there, I consulted for a number of emerging technology companies trying to work their way into government contracts and working with federal government. And then for the last year, and I should add, I've also been involved with venture capital and raising funds for startups trying to work in the national security space. But for the last year, I've been the the director of Nautilus, which is a partnership between NavalX, which I'll talk about in a minute. NavalX is a Navy innovation organization, and Nautilus is a partnership between NavalX and Defensewerx. And Defensewerx is a nonprofit out of Florida, which runs 10 different innovation hubs, all funded by federal labs. And so in that role as director of Nautilus, I get to go out and try to find really cool emerging technology companies and innovators that haven't necessarily dipped their toe in the waters of working with the federal government or the Department of Defense. I get to educate them about the problem sets that exist. And then I get to turn around and also educate people in the federal government. Hey, did you know that you could do some work with this other company that hasn't ever been on a government contract or doesn't know how to do that? So I like to say I'm kind of eHarmony.mil. I like to close the gap between the two sides of the commercial space and the government space, and especially around technology. Happy to talk about risk mitigation and retail with you today.
Thank you, Graham. This is exactly why he's our guest, guys. He does exactly what we back in the mid to late 2000s, we had a collaborative committee through RILA, Retail Industry Leaders Association. And that, Graham, if you don't know, is one of the major trade groups of retail. There's National Retail Federation, and there are a few others, but RILA is pretty big, NRF's very big. And we had a committee designed for that, a collaborative committee of about a dozen retailers that in the risk mitigation space, very different than merchandising or store operations. It's not competitive among retailers. So we routinely worked with Target, with Home Depot, Lowe's, Best Buy, because, at the end of the day, crooks are crooks. And if we could join hands on what a solution needs to look like and have a lowest common denominator, it helped those smaller firms say, look, if I engage with a conversation with Home Depot, for example, and Home Depot's like, that's cool, but it needs to do this. And then I went to Best Buy and they're like, but it also needs to do this. We took the approach that we can't do that because we're never going to get anywhere. And the smaller or emerging tech firms do not have that capital, and it's just not productive. They cannot have a suite of 38 different solutions to fix whatever retail. So we established some baseline criteria for every solution that came to the retail panel. And that was the lowest common denominator. So they knew if I was company X, if it fell apart with Walmart, then everybody else, as long as I met that lowest common denominator set of criteria, I could go and have a meaningful conversation with Meyer Foods in Grand Rapids or Albertsons or whomever. So that was our charter. I was fortunate enough to be the chair of that for probably 12 years before I retired from Walmart. And there's a desperate need, as all the listeners know, for more creative next generation solutions. An example being, in all the years, so I had now almost 30 years in retail, 22 actually as a W-2, that the solution set, Graham, has changed little from, the 70s and 80s and 90s. Risk mitigation, more commonly called asset protection or loss prevention in retail, is, depending on the company, sometimes the redheaded stepchild. It's always a cost to the business. And depending on who's in the driver's seat, who that officer is that's charged with that broad responsibility, is to what degree you have success in receiving real capital, not money for padlocks, but real capital to invest and do something a bit more creative that does not make us go back to what we see on LinkedIn all the time, which is logging chains running around merchandise and everything's locked up and security guards. So that's kind of where we're headed. And for the audience, Graham is the point of this discussion, if you're scratching your head, asking why in the hell is Brand talking to a defense guy? Number one, because that's where I find motivation, is talking to people that think differently. And certainly Graham is one of those few individuals. But more importantly is to plant the seed for the listener to be able to say, I am the staff jockey at Target. This is my responsibility, and I'm tired of buying more spider wrap and liquor locks and showcases. I really want to move the needle and do something different. That's this conversation. So at the end of this, you will have more than breadcrumbs to be able to explore that Graham will share with you, and kind of throw some gas on the fire from RELA and reinvigorate that discussion. So we'll switch over. We do have some questions, but guys, everybody that knows me knows I'm not a script guy. So we're going to go where the conversation goes. And then, as Matt said, please feel free to ask questions as we go. But Graham, I'll start off with, if you could give us a summary of who the main players in the public sector, which is your playground. Who are those main players in the R&D channel? Is it DARPA? Is it academia? Is it NIST? Kind of give us the layman's version of what that looks like.
Yeah, there are a lot of organizations that have been around for decades, or some of them are new. And, coming out of 9/11, we had a lot of spending on obviously countering weapons of mass destruction, countering terrorism. And we have been in, a couple decades sprint of rapid technological evolution. So as a result, a lot of the Department of Defense dollars have gone into innovation and innovation programs. And we've seen a lot of these new programs kind of taking on, a new direction. But some of the ones that have been around a long time are doing great work. The Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering really is the umbrella for a lot of the great programs, including the Defense Innovation Unit out in Silicon Valley, National Security Innovation Network in Crystal City in the DC area. You have Army Futures Command over in Austin, Texas, which is a 4-star command. It's a big move by Army to move a command to Austin, Texas, and it's really shaped a lot of the innovation ecosystem in Austin, which includes the Army Applications Laboratory there. You, of course, have the Office of Naval Research, which is what funds Nautilus, which is what I'm the director of. And ONR has been around for almost 100 years. They're coming up on their 100-year anniversary, I think, or National Naval Research Lab's coming up on 100 years, I think, in July this summer. Wow. And then you have Air Force Research Labs. You have AFWorks, which is actually originally a nonprofit that got brought into the Air Force to do a lot of technology scouting and incubation. You have the Army 75th Innovation Command, which is a reserve unit for Army to go out and interface with technology companies. Of course, you have NavalX that I mentioned, Marine Corps Innovation Unit and Marine Corps Logistics Innovation Units. You have the FFRDCs, MITRE, RAND, et cetera. Those are the federally funded research and development corporations. So those are kind of sit in between the think tanks and the government, and they're funded by the government. You have the national laboratories. A lot of them fall under Department of Energy, but Department of Defense has their own labs, and all the other departments have labs, and those are R&D organizations that employ a lot of civilians and commercial people, but are aligned with national interests. And of course, as you mentioned, with DARPA and IARPA, and then you have the SBIR process, which we can get into later, InQtel, which is with the CIA. It's a nonprofit that's a venture arm. And then you have the Office of Strategic Capital, which is brand new. And then you have partnership intermediary agreements, PIAs, which is what Nautilus is. It's a public-private partnership between a government organization and a nonprofit. And I'll stop there because the list goes on and on.
Well, I've been doing this, 25 years, maybe knocking on 30. And about 90% of what you just rattled off, I'd never heard of. That's awesome. We started with DARPA. And, it was in the mid 2000s. And believe it or not, retail there are people in retail that have engaged with DARPA, but it's rather limited. So anyway, it was basically a Google search. And at the time in the mid 2000s, DARPA was organized in, I think, about 6 silos. And the one that I thought was a good fit was what was then called the IPTO, the Information Processing Technologies Office. And essentially cold called, made a couple of visits. The first visit wasn't very inviting. We met in a Starbucks because the guy that was running it at the time's like, hey, we got a lot of classified stuff. Can't, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, all right. So anyway, we let that incubate for about 18 months. New guy took the chair, went up, and it was a completely different reception. The room was full of engineers, whiteboard exercises, and we explained to them what you just summarized. Here are our risks. Basically, here's what we do. This is where our pain points are. Can you help? Or are you working on anything, obviously in the unclassified space, that may have commercial application outside, the playpen of DoD? I gotta believe, Graham, that you mentioned out in Silicon Valley that the SVB bank collapse and a lot of the free flow capital pre that collapse was, a champagne party, very different than Europe. What impact has that had on the DoD funding, if any?
It's a great question, because Silicon Valley Bank was interested, more so than some of the other banks, in playing ball with national security tech companies. And so there were a number of startups that were working with Silicon Valley Bank and relying on Silicon Valley Bank. And we have heard anecdotally some of those companies that when their funding, was frozen or fell away, with the Silicon Valley Bank, that they were approached by adversarial capital from overseas. So it is a concern. On the other hand, the government contracts that exist with a lot of these companies, if they've made it far enough to make it over the valley of death, which we can talk about later, which is that process going from R&D to a longer term contract. Once they've made it over that valley, then they're less reliant on venture capital. We need to have programs that look at adversarial capital, and we need to have programs that look at the vulnerabilities around that. But one of the nice things about working with government, and we can talk about this also later, is that it's a large enterprise client. And so working with government means that once you won the contract, you can collateralize that and do all kinds of things with it.
Yeah, one thing I should say to kind of, as I always had to caution the guys, Lockheed and all these guys that wanted to understand the capital flow. I'm like, look, no retailer, certainly not Walmart, is going to write you a check for a couple of $1 billion and then have you come back in 5 years and figure out what you actually got done. That's not something typically. And I'm going back to mid and late 2000s, bit of a different, but certainly not in the magnitude that DoD can write those hefty checks and fund research. So is there space or appetite for understanding that if you're DARPA or you're NIST or whoever, one of the agencies you mentioned, and I don't have a lot of money, but I have a need of a business problem that something NavalX is working on with a few tweaks may actually solve a pressing retail problem. Is that a showstopper unless you've got a lot of money to dump in for research? How would that relationship materialize if I'm a retailer and I don't have $100 million to give you? Is that a showstopper?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah. So if I'm a retailer and I can't compete with capital like DoD does, Pentagon writes massive checks for research, MIT, they fund all that. Retailers traditionally don't, with some exceptions. Is that a showstopper if I came to you and said, I need to work on X but I've only got 50 grand? Does that cause a problem?
No, absolutely not. No, let's say that I'm a company. You're talking about if a startup wants to work in both retail and with the government, and you're trying to compete with the government. Yep. One of the talking points around what we'll talk about later, dual use technology, is that in the early days of Silicon Valley, really some of the tinder that lit the fire of the ecosystem there was DoD investment. But nowadays, because of the worldwide appetite for technology, really the Department of Defense and the intelligence community has to kind of ride along with commercial technology wherever it's going. So, I mean, from the retail perspective, you might feel like your R&D dollars are dwarfed by national security R&D dollars, but realistically, according to the national appetite, for technology and international appetite for technology, our R&D dollars are dwarfed by commercial. And so, and we realize that we see, we're doing analysis on how to make use of dual use R&D investments and matching dollars with investments on the private side. So absolutely, if I were a startup and interested in R&D from the government perspective, I would also be interested in the commercial R&D dollars.
Okay, because oftentimes retailers will, and I certainly did while I was at Walmart, explore those opportunities and necessarily come across some of those smaller emerging firms. For example, a big tech conference, one of the biggest on the planet for retail, is EuroShop in Dusseldorf every February. 80 to 120,000 attendees. It's a massive retail show, and of the 18 or 20 convention halls that comprise the event, probably 3 or 4 are nothing but retail tech. So it's cashierless stores, it's frictionless drones, all the stuff you hear about. And to invite that, those smaller firms are like, well, we need capital, because as you know, Graham, the venture capital flows up before SVB collapse were very restrictive, differently than the US in Europe. So you see earlier stage tech in Europe because they don't have an Elon Musk behind them that gives them $100 trillion. And there you go. You never see it until it's ready. In Europe, you see it very early. So that's useful that, what you just said about, the capital and being able to partner and bring to market when I am a retailer and I don't have a budget where I can go and dump $100 million into an exploration. So how does this process work? In layman's terms, from a bar napkin idea, Graham and Brand are in, Georgetown having a beer. We have a great conversation and we're like, you know what? I think I know a couple of firms. Walk me through that baby step process from the idea. How do I find a potential provider? Use an example, if you will, of holograms. That's becoming of interest in retail, virtual customer service, to funding and development. Kind of in a nutshell, I know that's a massive ask, but kind of what does that look like in a Reader's Digest version?
From the innovator's perspective, if I'm sitting at the bar with you and we have a napkin and we have an idea, one of the first places I might want to take that idea is called the SBIR grant, the Small Business and Innovation Research Grant Program,
okay,
which is a multi-billion-dollar a year federal grant program. So if anyone's listening and wants to investigate it, it's sbir.gov. And you can see all the open information about which government agencies are funding grants there. But the idea is it's broken up in 3 phases. And phase 1, might be, $50,000, $100,000, $150,000, depending on what agency you're talking about. And that can be awarded relatively quickly. And it can be done relatively early in your development of the idea. And so if you've got a napkin idea and you've got a good leadership team and you can put together a good presentation, maybe you can win a phase 1 SBIR and get a little bit of money, and that's non-dilutive, so that's not taking any equity out of your company. From the phase 1 to the phase 2, it's obviously more competitive, but the phase 2 is really designed to give you some runway to build your prototype. And so it might be $1 million for a year or more, and then give you access and a pathway towards scaling it for a federal government use case. So in a phase 3 is technically a regular government contract. But the nice thing about the phase 3 is that you can do it on basically a sole source capability. So typically, if you're going to go after a government contract, you have to compete against other companies. But once you go through the SBIR process, it gives you some expedited contracting capabilities. So SBIR.gov is one place to look at for opportunities for napkin ideas. Of course, there's a lot of other programs that I mentioned before.
Yeah.
And if you're going to go from napkin to a full-fledged company, then you need to get familiar with what's called a TRL scale, the technology readiness levels.
Yeah.
And anyone can Google TRL scale and see what that means. But all the different federal agencies that do R&D, they use this 9-point scale that takes it from basic research as level 1 all the way up to a system test and launch and operations, which is TRL 9. So different programs will align to different TRLs. And if you have something that's napkin, then you're talking about TRL 1, 2, 3. If you have something that's prototype but not ready to print 1,000 of them, maybe your TRL 4, 5, 6. And then once you get kind of tested and ready to scale, then you're the later TRL levels. And from there, you can kind of approach which programs you want to approach.
Awesome. So for the listeners, correct me if I'm wrong, Graham, that is SBIR.gov, Sierra Bravo India Romeo, spelled out, .gov. That's awesome. And, for the retailers, guys, if I still had my blue badge on, I would explore that because, when I'm talking to these smaller firms that, are cash strapped and starved, that might be an avenue to help them, introduce them to the SBIR process and kick that process off for the good of, total retail, not just individual retailers. You mentioned something, Graham, on, let's say I go to SBIR and I'm successful as a startup. One of the things that we all know in retail, well, stealing technology is not new. But in retail, that's always a concern. If I'm a third-party provider and I go to Retail X, and it's primarily software, which obviously is a heck of a lot easier to steal than, manufacturing hardware, a physical product. There's always that hesitancy that, I got to be loaded for bear, I got to have IPs, patents, I got to have, firewall, I got to do all kinds of things, encryption to safeguard my idea. Is that, when you talk about the SBIR process in the public space, is that a threat to a small company or is the Pentagon and these major funders just looking to develop and bring to market? Have you ever run across that concern of, you got to be careful with this agency because they're more interested in stealing it than producing?
Yeah, let me answer that in a second. I will mention for those who are in retail that would like to piggyback on, federal R&D dollars. You can go to the SBIR.gov website and you can run queries and see what companies have won SBIRs. It's public information. The databases are available for your search. So let's say you'd like to look for a certain capability for retail and you look at under contested logistics or something like that, or logistics or tracking of physical products or physical security. You're going to find all kinds of emerging tech in the SBIR.gov website that might have dual use with retail, and you can just contact them and piggyback on what R&D has already been invested in that company.
Perfect.
To answer your question about the IP issues, intellectual property is a concern for a startup. For a couple of reasons when you get into national security. Obviously, in some cases, when you sell to the federal government, as you're hinting at, they want to own that technology. So the question is for the innovator, well, if I give it away to the government, can I still commercialize it somewhere else? And, what's the trade-off here? Mm-hmm. And so in some cases, you might want to create a federal subsidiary for your company and do carve-outs for your IP. There's also concern about prime contractors that you partner with wanting the IP. If you're a small business and then you are selling to the federal government through a larger company, they're the prime and you're the subcontractor, then you might want to protect the IP, and that can cause some friction points with the contract fulfillment if you're not careful. And then the third concern is, of course, adversary nations. getting access to the IP, because as you promote your capability, sometimes it becomes something that another country wants to copy and paste. So there's a couple different areas, minefields to watch out for as you scale a startup into federal national security related stuff. But fortunately, there's a lot of experts in that field. And so if any companies are interested to get introduced to, intellectual property experts, I'm happy to help.
Yeah, in retail, as we always say, if your solution is sexy, it's high risk. So if it answers more than just keeping the crook from stealing something, chances are most retailers are not going to put enough systems and technical effort forward to replicate is the nice word, or duplicate. But if it's in the AI space and it can not only do behavior analysis for nefarious intent, kind of some of the stuff TSA was working on after 9/11 of in the security line, the guy is sweating, his eyes are moving left and right and darting around. He's obviously, that kind of stuff. That has appeal. So, in my consulting business, I kind of go through a sexiness factor. And when I have clients, I'm like, okay, this is super sexy, which means you really got to have your guard up because this is of broad interest to retail. So in the DoD space or the public space, is there a conscious effort on commercialization of a technology, or is it pretty narrow to whatever the intended mission was, i.e., communications on M1 tanks, improving encrypted communications on an M1 tank? Does it ever come across? It's like, I bet this has commercial application too. What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, the R&D programs that exist, some of them really want to do both. They want to spin out technologies from federal labs and spin in technologies from commercial to federal use. There's a lot of hype around the term dual use technology, in the sense that technology nowadays, pretty much any technology in my book, it has a dual use in federal and in commercial markets. Some people will say, well, what about missiles or something like that? And we'll say, well, break down the missile to its components, navigation and things like that. There's probably all kinds of dual uses of the pieces.
Yeah.
So really technology comes down to, as a system, dual market. Can you sell it in both places? And if you're a company that's trying to sell on the private side into enterprise plus to consumer, plus B2B, then you have to think about how you're going to prioritize your sales objectives. And that's the same thing with government sales. It's just a very large enterprise client that's very complex. And the benefits can outweigh the risks or vice versa. So if you're talking about figuring out if you want to sell into government, you just have to figure out if you have enough stomach for the long sales cycle, and if you have, if there's enough margin and enough competition that it's worth it.
Yeah, that translates directly to retail. Very long sales cycle. It's not uncommon to take a solution to a retailer. And when I was there, I was the guy in the risk mitigation division. And I won't mention the provider's name, but they're the leader in their industry. But it took from first phone call to a signed contract almost 5 years before we got them on board, because maybe not unlike DoD, there were capital commitments and priorities and, 6,000 presentations and convincing. And one of the things that hamstrings the risk mitigation space, at least in nefarious intent theft, is factual evidence to be able to prove to the naysayer it actually is a problem. And I don't want to take a lot of time on that because obviously all of our listeners, if they're retail, they get it. But you only know what you catch, and then you do an inventory at the end of the year, and your ledger says you should have $1 million in the building, and you count everything and do all the financials, and it says 900,000. Well, you shrink out $100,000. Where the hell is it? And that's when the soup sandwich is served, because it is not a finite, clean business to get back to, I know I never received 50 plasma 68-inch LCD TVs. Or so it's kind of a poking around in the dark to some degree. We got a lot better. So the industry providers, AI has helped immensely. And that tipped probably about 15-ish, 14, 15-ish, 2015 in retail. So let's shift gears here. The developmental day-to-day process in retail, I'll summarize that it's pretty much, depending on the retailer you're with, it's to a degree reactive. It's like, oh crap. So every retailer on the planet today is going through unprecedented loss levels. I haven't talked to a retailer yet that's not like, oh my God, we're hemorrhaging. So that being said, for all various reasons, the development process and the appetite for exploration is limited. So if Graham, you're the vice president of asset protection, say for Lowe's, DIY, then you're like, dude, don't bring me something 3 years from now. My ass is on fire now. So what do you have? Is that also common in DoD where you have urgent need? For example, my biggest example would be the up armored Humvees for the Iraq War. They sent down the thin skins. Obviously, we had severe challenges with that, so they had to scramble. What does that look like in DoD? The prioritization and urgency.
The programs that I mentioned at the beginning are all over a spectrum of rapid equipping type innovation or lean startup innovation, all the way up to moonshot innovation. You mentioned DARPA, that's high risk, high reward. If it doesn't work, put it on the shelf, try it again later.
Yep.
So a lot of people throw the word innovation around. They refer to both sides of that spectrum, but that's not really fair, because if you're in the middle of a war, or if you're a retail company and you're hemorrhaging, money from theft or something like that, then you have a critical problem and you need to solve it. And you might want to solve it with an innovative solution, or you might want to throw a Band-Aid on it and figure it out tomorrow with more innovation. But in the meantime, you're not going to have 3 years to work with,
Yeah.
But in the military, we have large platforms too. So we're always thinking about, what's going to come down the pike in 4 to 10 years, So we do have to do long-term acquisition of new technologies. We have to think about fighting the next war, and we don't want to fight the next war with the technology of the last war. So, we have to build the plane and fly at the same time.
I've heard that before, build the plane while in flight, because that's really helpful to know that, yes, there are some urgent need channels you can go versus the more exploration, because, frankly, where we are in retail today, everything, Graham, that you see in media or on LinkedIn, social media, those are solutions that we've used since the first general store opened in Kansas. It's not innovation, it's locking it up. And the analogy I always use on the podcasts and talking to my clients and retailers too, I'm like, if we had any better options, you would not see that. And so it's an indictment on the industry that, the innovation still, while getting better, can be a whole lot better. And what it takes is, a Graham Plaster with Target Company, for example, to say, what, enough. We got to do something different. So that it's fertile ground for innovation in retail. I would guess that one of the biggest limitations would be that free flow capital and the patience to say it may be 2 years when we go and talk to this guy that's working on something else for DoD. It may take another couple of years. Unfortunately, with the leadership turnover and, people getting promoted out, same thing I know happens with program managers in the Pentagon. It's almost starting all over again. When that supportive champion VP gets promoted to EVP and he's going to take over HR, oh, well, hell, the new guy comes in. It's like, all right, we need to level set and let's go through this again. So the appetite and the patience, I'm glad to hear that, there are opportunities for expediting, just depending on what we're looking for.
I mean, there's always an appetite to move fast, but one of the slogans at Facebook in the early days was move fast or run fast and break things.
Yep.
And one of the mantras from Silicon Valley was disruption theory, which is companies get large and bureaucratic and slow, and then small companies can move fast and innovate around them, disrupt them. But when you're talking about national security, you don't want to create a system of constant disruption. Yeah, you might want to innovate and you might want to change systems, but you need stability, you know. And so the same might be true in retail. And so that's the question. If we're not looking to disrupt, but we're looking to innovate, like what's the proper medium with constant challenging of the norms so that we can improve our processes and our technologies without, you know, thwarting our efficiency, you know, with as a system.
That's a really good point. You know, I was on active duty 12 years. I was an artillery officer. When did I get commissioned? 84, and then got out in 95, and then very unplanned got invited to Afghanistan in 03. So I was recalled to active duty and spent time down there. And it was striking at troop level what had not changed from my previous 8 years. Conversations were very much the same. The stabilization, the predictable path, and we always at the embassy and Office of Military Cooperation under then General Eikenberry, we always got visitors from the Pentagon. Everybody wanted to poke their nose in the business. And then, of course, that changed on March 20th of 03 when we started the ground war in Iraq. We became less of interest. But those solutions you talked about, what I'm going to ask, only because it's on my mind, and Matt, I hope you're okay with this. If Graham, after the podcast or the broadcast today, if you could do some hot links and send them over to Matt on answering, you know, the inevitable question of the listener, how in the hell do I get started? A handful of organizations, SBIR being a great one. Where would I get started? I just wanted to mention that before I forgot. If for every dollar in capital and spend, what percentage would you say is classified versus unclassified, to give our listeners a sense of, you know, because obviously they're not going to play in the classified space in private sector.
I mean, they do. The private sector can sell into the intelligence community. The request for budget, the top line request, so it's public information for the National Intelligence Program for next year is $72 billion. And for the National Defense Authorization Act that was passed this year, that's a $847 billion bill for the year. And of that bill, the research expenses are in the $140 billion range. So there's a lot of money in both on the defense side and on the intelligence side. And the number that I gave for the intelligence is it's a top line number, so it doesn't break down, you know, RD, T&E or any of that. But you know, as far as like how to get involved or where to get involved, I think the SBIR.gov is a good starting point for people that know nothing. If you are a commercial company that has emerging technology, then you can go look at the website for In-Q-Tel and see what they do. But typically what they're doing is bringing in companies that they go out and find and bring in and kind of court to get involved with national security.
Okay. That sounds like a staggering amount of money. What is the average? And I know that I'm asking you a lot of tough questions and you're doing a fantastic job bringing it back to us. But what in your estimation is an average? You mentioned sales cycle. So from idea to product, in general, is that years? Is it, and I know it depends on a lot of things, but what's your swag on that?
So from idea to prototype, if you go through SBIR, you could do that inside of a year.
Wow.
And you know, in some cases, the Air Force, for example, has done very rapid phase 1 SBIRs in a matter of weeks. But if you want to take that and go all the way to like a phase 3 SBIR or a program record long-term contract with the government, the typical government sales cycle is 18 to 24 months or 1 to 2 years, really depending on. That's assuming you're going to be doing a competitive contract and you're bidding on several things. You're looking at your percentage win ratios, and you know, it means you're going to probably put out some money and some effort to go after those contracts that are big enough to employ your staff and everything.
Yeah.
So there are some ways to expedite that. There's sole source contracting methods, and there's some things that you can look at with GSA schedule, which might take a little while to get on there, but that is kind of like a Sears catalog for purchasing things from the private sector, or the SEWP contracts. That's SEWP. That was a contract vehicle innovated by NASA in the early days, and now it's popularized across government. Also, it kind of works like a Sears catalog. Once you get on the SEWP schedule, the SEWP contract, then the government can buy your stuff very quickly. So there's different things you can do to kind of speed up the process. It really kind of depends on what kind of product or service you're offering. For retailers, it's worth looking at the exchanges, the military exchanges, because we have a whole system around the world and online of government subsidized department stores, So these Army and Navy and Marine Corps and Air Force exchanges are big department stores that are on all the military bases, and they have to buy from somewhere. And in a lot of cases, they're buying from smaller companies. I'll share the link to how to do business with the military exchanges in the links I send over to you.
Okay. It's funny. This is telling. 18 to 24 month sales cycle is rapid fire in most cases in retail. That's pretty bad when the Pentagon outpaces private sector in innovation and delivery. That's quick. I think most of our listeners would be thrilled if from bar napkin to a product, it was less than.
I would say I'll amend that from, you're not going from bar napkin to products in 24 months. What I'm talking about, if you have a prototype that works and it's been tested, and you have a sales team, at least one salesperson that starts a structured sales cycle, then I think 24 months you could do it. That's still quick. If you were to ask me that question in Washington, I would have said, well, my God, probably a career span of an average, program manager. It would be, from the idea when he was a second lieutenant, and maybe when he pins on 06, it would actually get delivered to the fleet. So that's encouraging. Most of the innovative efforts, the source of these ideas, so those bar napkin conversations, in your estimation, is that more closed loop, organic, meaning mainly a bunch of smart guys in DARPA sit down and start hammering out, pie in the sky moonshot? Or is it you guys stumble across some guy in Israel that's doing something super cool? It's like, holy crap, we need to do this. Where is the source of the innovation? Is it organic or is it external in your estimation? It's both. Like I said before, there's a spectrum of types of innovation, and there is a growing desire to engage with national security technology right now. There's a lot of excitement about dual use technologies, and there's investment into the space. So, investors and entrepreneurs are paying attention. I think there's, concern depending on what type of innovator you are on if you're going to play ball with offensive or defensive national security technologies. So if you feel queasy about building bombs and bullets, then there's still plenty of things you can do with sensors, radars, and shields, that type of thing. So, but there, a lot of innovations coming from the private sector through various programs. And through that's the whole thing that I do through the partnership intermediary agreement with Nautilus, is bringing commercial tech into the space. That's what Incatel does, brings commercial tech in. On the other hand, all the national labs that are funded through Department of Energy and through the FFRDCs and through DARPA and IARPA, they have a lot of tech that they've incubated in-house that can be commercialized. And there's a great benefit to doing that, because it takes a technology that's a concept, gives it legs in the commercial space, and then it becomes a company that has viability and longevity, which is good for the national security buyer, because you can't just buy an idea. You have to buy something that has a sustainment package to it. That's
interesting that we always, if you think about it, from the outside looking in, most of the technologies today that we take for granted and use, ranging from your smartphone to GPS to internet and everything else has its roots and its origins in Defensewerx somewhere along the lines, all the way back from the 1950s and before. And then at some point, it becomes
just to
commercial.
clarify, Brand, Defensewerx is a nonprofit that I work for.
Yeah.
So when you say you're talking about the Department of Defense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So all those technologies somehow came out of public sector. It wasn't, rest in peace, Steve Jobs or Sam Walton. They didn't create GPS. I mean, those things came out of defense initiatives. And that, that's really what piqued my interest. I was, as you know, maybe it's the same in the Navy, but as an Army officer, you have to have a functional area, something else other than I was an artillery officer, but you also had a specialty, and mine was R&D. In keeping with the Army bureaucracy, I never actually got to work in that field, but it was always an interest. And then when I decided to get out, and then the mid-2000s came along, we had that flexibility, that VP I talked about, and that started all of what we're talking about with retail is like, why in the hell aren't we doing something different? And at the time, it was limited to DARPA. NIST, we had a fleeting relationship with NIST. Couple of former NSA guys that are over in Annapolis, over in your old camp, that still have great connections to help bridge that gap. But it's still a emerging initiative, Graham. It's not something that's broadly practiced in retail. So we have about 9 minutes left. So winding it down a little bit, if I'm a retailer and I just listened to this and I'm like the Brand Elverston of 2005. I'm like, holy crap, this is the guy. How do I initiate that if I don't know squat? I've never been a veteran, so I don't know anything about federal stuff. You mentioned SBIR. Are you okay with a listener pinging you on LinkedIn to connect, and then having those conversations?
I'm happy to talk to retailers. And, to be honest, one of the priorities for the Navy right now is something called contested logistics. If we think about kind of the post-COVID national security environment, we can look back and see how vulnerable we felt when we couldn't get things that we wanted to order, like toilet paper.
Yeah.
Right. So in that situation, logistics and supply chains are part of the national security issue. So retailers are playing part in that. And, a lot of people stepped in and won, defense contracts to get, PPE and toilet paper and things like that on a moment's notice. And so there's a certain amount of innovation that comes in retail and supply that is very interesting to us. And, so feel free to reach out to me. And maybe there's a nexus there that we can work together. If not, I can definitely point people in the right direction.
Yeah, some of the, the retailers, so Walmart, for example, pretty sophisticated logistics network. Really, that was one of their, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, one of their early distinct competitive advantages was the sophistication of distribution, followed quickly by the technology division that came about in, I'm going to screw that up, whatever year it was. It was before I landed in retail in 1995. I was still on active duty. And, some with the degree of veterans that are out there, both officer, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted that make their way to private sector, the appetite, I think, has gotten better. Maybe a positive after the two wars. So many veterans now are in the private space that at least have the question mark over their head like I did. It's like, you know what? I've seen something else. Why in the hell are we still banging our head against a wall and tasing shoplifters like we did back in 1950? We got to do something different. The bigger ask, Graham, for solutions is not only then what is distinctly referenced as the nefarious intent, the theft. That's what is sexy in the industry. That's what gets all the attention. It's the violence. That's what grabs the headlines. But loss occurs from when you create the purchase order, that opportunity for loss. So we don't know in retail, did Procter & Gamble actually ship me, and I'm just picking on them because they're the world's biggest CPG. Did they actually send me 100 million boxes of Crest white strips? Did it make it through the distribution cycle? Did the container ship from China fall off the boat, or we never got it in the first place? So all of those complexities go into this. So the ask would be, I would hope from the retailer, is answering a business problem, not just, stop the crackhead from coming in and grabbing all the beer and running out the door. That is one grain of sand on the beach in terms of the complexity of the problem. I want to give you open mic time. We have 5 minutes, Graham, to fill in any gaps that you may have referenced and we didn't get a chance to talk about, but I'll turn it over to you and then we'll do a wrap up.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your listeners. And for those that want to get involved with Nautilus, if you have a company, you can go to nautilus22.org, and there's a button there that says join the ecosystem. And that's really for any kind of company that wants to provide services to the Navy and the Marine Corps and their partners. So you can check it out. It only takes about 10 minutes to fill out the form. And we're interested in all kinds of companies and all kinds of innovators. You could be an individual that just has good ideas. You could be an academic organization. But if you want to get involved with what we're doing and you fill out that form, then you might just get an invitation from us to an event that includes some warfighters with problems. And then we can brainstorm together and see how we can solve that.
Are there any conference venues that would be a good idea, that it's not going to be, exclusively DoD guys in the room, but is there somewhere the layman could come and sit in, like, the one I met you at, that is apparent partnerships of public and private? Are there any consistent conferences that off the top of your head you're aware of?
Yeah, there's hundreds. So Defense Entrepreneurs Forum has great opportunities to attend. Of course, all of the Defensewerx hubs have events that are published. Softworks hosts things. Soft Week is coming up. That's a big one. And then AFCEA, INSA, NDIA, all the trade associations and national security have events all the time. You have AUSA, the Association of the U.S. Army, has a huge annual conference in DC. It was great this year. You have Sea Airspace. The Navy had one a couple weeks ago. It's really good. So yeah, if they want to know what event to attend, they can contact me, and I can point them in the right direction. But there's more events to attend than anyone has time to attend.
Yeah, that's kind of the way it is in retail. But the funny thing is, it's not a lot different. You go to one forum, still the same issues. We're all being confronted by the same thing. So the option for something that is strikingly different is kind of narrow. So it'd be good to be able to discuss some of that. Well, thanks a million, dude. I greatly appreciate it. I look forward to continuing what we do and, hopefully have you back as a guest, because I got to believe that for the listeners either right now or the ones that listen on the way to work, one morning, will pique their interest, and then we can, continue, as we say in retail, to try and move the needle with something a bit more non-traditional. We don't have any questions in the queue, Matt, that I'm aware of. So I'm kind of talking slow to see if one pops up, because we have 2 minutes. So anyway, Graham, thanks a million, dude. Greatly appreciate it. Matt will be in touch to see if he can grab a handful of those hot links and some other stuff you may want to get out to the listeners. And we will be talking soon. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day, dude.
You too.
See ya.